Hey, good morning. This is Pastor Doug. We're here again for another installment of None of These Diseases. We're going to be looking at chapters 16 and 17. They've got a variety of different titles that he gave them. I'm just going to call them Giants, Church Bells, Panthers, oh my. So he starts out with an opportunity for you to give the diagnosis. He has a 27-year-old young farmer comes into his office and he gives these symptoms. And I am just all tuckered out. I start across the field on my tractor and I get so weak, I've just got to stop and get off and go lay down in the shade by the fence so that I just get enough strength again so I can carry on. Remember, this is back in the 50s and driving a tractor was a little more work. He says, it's not like me. I just don't normally uh, have such weakness. And for the past month, I've been just completely bushed. I've been losing weight too, and I can't sleep. All right, you're the doctor. What are you going to tell him? What could be wrong with him? Dr. McMillan said, man, a lot of things went through his mind. It could be anemia, leukemia, internal bleeding, the possibility of cancer or tuberculosis. And so he does what any doctor would do. He orders a physical exam and laboratory tests, but they all come back showing no organic trouble. Now, what's your diagnosis? Well, he brings him back in, talks to him, asks a few more questions about what's going on in his life. And he finds out that this kid is under a lot of stress and he is full of fear. He is an attractive fiance who's starting to meet around with some other guys, and it's causing him some concern. He's fearful that she is just going to choose someone better than a farmer like him. And then there's this man who promised to give him a really good deal on a used car. He's been saving up for it, needs it. But when he's about ready to make the deal, the guy raises the price by $200. And $200 was a big deal back in those days. The issues, man, are mental or psychosomatic, whatever term you want to use. He's fearful. He's full of worry. He's anxious. Maybe his car, maybe his can't get his work done in time for the proper seasons and things he's trying to accomplish in the field. Fear of losing his girlfriend. There is a doctor, at least was back then, Hans Sille, Selye, who at that time was a world authority on stress. I guess that's sort of job security if you're going to go into that field. Um, and he says that long and continued stress, exposure to it, results in, you guessed it, exhaustion, which is something that we could relate to today. Now, with this COVID-19, we have a prolonged exposure to stress related to it, fears related to it, and uncertainties, and of course, of the political climate right now, in an election year, who are moving and prying on our fears. People are getting to that point where they've been exposed so long, they're trying to figure out adapt, not necessarily adapting too well to it, and they are getting to the point of exhaustion. Well, Dr. McMillan said, it's not work that makes us exhausted, it's weariness that is the worry in our lives. So, how did he treat him? Well, in a way that you and I couldn't. He gave him a few sedatives, he got him relaxed, his strength came back, his confidence improved, and good ending to the story. He won the girl and got married to her. Don't know about the car. Perhaps you probably had some similar experiences. Some days you may work hard from morning till night and be perfectly good, not a problem. And other days, man, you just can hardly get past the morning and into the afternoon. You're down, you're tired, you're exhausted. The next time you experience this sort of swing and strength of life, just stop and ask yourself this simple question: are your emotions upset? Are you under anxiety? Are you experiencing fear? It could be anything. Maybe your boss is looking over your shoulder, seeing how you're working from home as opposed to how you're working in the office, and wanting to know if that's just the best that you could do. Maybe you've ordered a new outfit and you wore it for the first time, maybe giving yourself a new look that you're really excited about, but no one even notices. Uh, there's a lot of ways to worry, a lot of ways that it comes into our lives. Maybe you're wondering what's going to happen to the people around you and how do you keep them safe. Patients whose exhaustion is related to their emotions will talk about being exhausted at those early hours of the day. If they had slept well, if they had really did so and woke up exhausted, maybe they're breathing. We talk about people with CPAPs, they sleep all night, wake up exhausted. Maybe it's a breathing, physical kind of thing, but if none of that checks out, it could be that they are weary. They are becoming exhausted emotionally, and no amount of sleep will bring you out of that exhaustion. Worry and anxiety that is taken to bed will keep you in it. So, what are some remedies? Well, these are some old-fashioned remedies. You could count your blessings when you get laid down to go to sleep, despite all the problems, all the worries, and the anxieties. You could say, well, I've got my health, I've got my family, and you could start there and continue on and begin to count the blessings that God has given you. You can also just thank the Lord for his goodness, for his kindness, for his grace, and you could begin to cast your cares on him. There are a lot of scenarios where it shows that these kinds of problems really do have a physical effect. He gives the story of 5-year-old Tony. He didn't come in on his own. His mom brought him. He's plastered with hives. Mother's bewildered, and she's wanting to know, what's causing my Tony to break out like this? Well, she begins to explain, haven't changed the diet, haven't changed the clothes, the materials, or the washes, no allergic reactions they can come up with. And so he keeps poking into questions, and he finds a pattern. And she says, well, yeah, he seems to break out in these hives after he comes home from his aunt's house. Maybe it's an exposure to something that's going on there, but maybe it's an exposure to the aunt. And as they find out, she keeps her house spick and span. They are nearly gods to her. And, well, 5-year-old Tony isn't too worried about spick and span. He's making a mess, he's causing trouble, and he gets scolded from the moment he hits the door to the moment he goes home. And he is fearful anytime he hears that he is going to his aunt's house. So the good advice that the doctor gave her was, hey, next time that you need to go somewhere and you've got to park little Tony somewhere, don't take him to his aunt's house. Just get some distance there. Don't put him in that environment. And she started doing that, and you guessed it, the hives went away. Then he talks about Miss Shirley Johnson arriving at the office with nearly both eyes swollen shut, her lips swollen nearly 3 times their normal size. She is experiencing what he called angioneurotic edema. So often, the cause is shown to be emotional stress that has an impact on the way our skin looks and reacts. For her, there's a fear of driving in the city. I don't know if driving to the doctor's office made it worse for her. And she's also fearful of the hustle and the bustle of entertaining people at her house. And they are husbands always bringing people in from work and people from other places that she has to entertain. And it just stresses her out. Angio, the heart, neurotic, indicates the stress that comes from, of course, the emotions. Nice big words, doesn't really change anything. Still the same problem. Then he just talks about a male patient who developed asthma every time he heard church bells ring. And I don't know about you, as soon as I heard that, I'm going like, yeah, this is another guy that's got some emotional problems. His asthma can be triggered by stress. Fear and tension can aggravate the condition. And so he finds out this guy's story. When he was young, he was waiting at the church for his bride to arrive. And as the church bells were ringing, a messenger arrived with a note saying that his fiancée had changed her mind and she wasn't showing up to get married. And now every time he hears those church bells, it induces another attack of asthma, as he experienced on that same day when he first received that note. So there you go. From his experience, I'm sure you probably have ideas or stories in your own life to say, yep, I can confirm that that kind of stuff really happens. And we are given that promise going through this study that this is a disease, this is a trigger that we don't have to have in our lives. And so on comes David and Goliath. And this is certainly a giant in our lives. We all like David. King David's a great guy in the Bible. He had more than one reason to be justifiably fearful. He had experienced fearful situations, but of course he overcame them, and it might have given him some confidence when he was a shepherd, where he had to face a lion and a bear, and then eventually Goliath. He frequently has to escape from King Saul, who seeks to kill him at seemingly every opportunity. And how did David escape from not coming down with a host of psychosomatic illnesses that plague the rest of people who, well, just aren't like him? David, despite his moral failures, and he had plenty, did trust the Lord. He was able to say things like, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Though an army should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though the war should rise against me, I can stand confident." High blood pressure can be caused not only by hate, as we've covered in earlier lessons, but also by these worries, these fears that we carry in our lives, fears that we hold on to, thinking that we are the ones who have to do something about it, rather than turning our fears over to God and trusting Him to take care of us, even if we don't deserve it. A lot of doctors actually try to keep their patients from knowing about their own blood pressure. I don't know about you and how you are about your blood pressure, but it's actually a practice in the medical field to keep patients from actually being able to understand their blood pressure, because if it's already elevated and they find out it's elevated and it's a result of them worrying and being fearful and that sort of person, then they hear that it's elevated, then they're in this cycle, then they're scared, and it goes up even higher. And so there are some medical textbooks that actually encourage doctors to practice judicious lying. This maneuver, and this is a quote from a textbook, this maneuver may effectively prevent the patient from developing an anxiety neurosis and heart consciousness. It has been our belief and experience that most of the subject's symptoms associated with essential hypertension, that's high blood pressure, and are psychogenetically induced emotionally. The quotation demonstrates the importance of the giant worry has in just nearly everyone's lives, and the impact it has on our health in a negative way. And the doctor's idea of, well, we'll just deceive the patient, it's really not a good way to go. They're eventually going to find out they need to be treated for it some manner, some way, and they are going to find out that the doctor had been lying to them, and it's probably going to make them lose their confidence in that doctor. So, got to be something better. So back to David. We'd much rather have something like his solution in our lives. Here he is, a young boy coming in, going out to the field, and he's got to figure out whether he is going to cower or conquer. So a little bit of history. King Saul and the army were cowering in the face of the Philistines and Goliath, their champion. Instead of having an all-out war, the giant was stepping out and he was saying, "You send your best and the two of us will go one-on-one. Best man takes all." And little old David is stirred by Israel's lack of faith in God to fight for them. He refuses to accept the methods of fighting joints that Saul tries to put on him. You're going to need this armor, you're going to need this sword. He's like, "You know what? I'm just going to trust God, and I'm going to use the skills I already have, my trusty little slingshot." And we love that picture of little David carrying his slingshot and his 5 smooth stones going up against Goliath in all of his armor and might and size. Goliath who's mocking David. And we have to ask the question, was David afraid? Well, we do get this quote from David. In the day when I am afraid, I will still have confidence in you. In God, I will praise him for his word. In God, I trust. I will not fear. What can flesh do to me? We like those kinds of confident statements of saying that even in the face of fear that there might be anxiety on our part, but overall we put our trust in God. We do have that phrase in our money, and trust be God. Right now there's even a lawsuit going forward against Mississippi who's trying to change their flag, and the governor says, well, we're going to change it, but we need those words, in God we trust on it. And there are people who do not want those words on their flag. They don't want a reminder of the very thing that they need. They need to be trusting in God, and so do we. We don't just need to have it on our money. We need to tuck it away in our hearts, in our minds, so that when we come across fearful situations, we will put our trust in God. Not only did David conquer Goliath, but he overcame perhaps his own anxieties as he's walking out in faith, trusting God. Perhaps this is why we often turn to the Psalms whenever we are feeling anxiety and we are facing fears, because David experienced them, and so he wrote heartfelt expressions about putting his fears and his cares and his worries on God. I was always taught to think of the book of Psalms as the prayers of people in trouble, and that person was primarily David, and how he looked forward and cast his cares on God. And even though he was aware of the danger around him, aware that this was not a safe situation, aware that the odds were against him, he was willing to trust God and to go forward. To those who are dubious about the ability of God, his word, his spirit, to cope with modern problems, there's a guy, Dr. Howard Kelly, who is a Christian, and he had something pertinent to say onto it that's quoted in the book. And so this is a medical doctor who is a believer who says, I testify that the Bible is the Word of God because it is food for the spirit, just as definitely bread and meat are food for the body. The Bible appeals strongly to me as a physician because it is such an excellent medication. It has never yet failed to cure a single patient if only they took the prescription. No prescription has ever helped more people than one of David's Psalms, Psalm 23. It can be taken with meals. It can be taken before retiring. It is to be taken as needed. Of course, it only works for you if you believe in God. I once visited with someone who was going into surgery who was not a believer, and I was trying to give him comfort. And so I came in with Psalm 23, quoted it with him, prayed with him. He went on into surgery. He survived that surgery and came out. I went by to visit with him, and he told me, don't you ever talk about going through the valley of the shadow of death before anyone goes into surgery again. That made me fearful. And I guess if you don't know the God who is the Good Shepherd, and you don't put your trust in him, it could be very fearful. So another farmer story back in 1963. He had a complaint about his abdomen. He was suffering with it. And as he was complaining this to Dr. McMillan, he noticed that his hands were a little deformed. And so he just asked, how long have you had this arthritis? He says, well, ever since I was about 9. You see, there was this panther scare in the area where I was growing up. And going and returning to school, I had to go through a section of the woods, and I was afraid that I was going to be eaten by a panther, attacked and killed. And so I'd try to be brave. I'd start off into it. My fears would rise, and then I would take off running as fast as I could until I got to the other side, heart pounding. And he said this went on for weeks and weeks. And he says, and during that time, my hands started to look like this, and they've been that way ever since. I didn't know about this connection, but evidently there is a real connection between fear, anxiety, and arthritis, and even some other emotional disturbances. Doctors back in the time that this book was written were aware of the connection, but they just weren't aware of the mechanisms that were at work to have those things impact one another. Many who were crippled in their joints gave clear testimony, like this man did, of the connection between the two. The disease, though, after it becomes established, those people suffer with flare-ups, with it spreading in prolonged tensions and days, keeping them from able to really work and use their joints like others. And it becomes a point of stress to themselves. Stress, such as breaking an engagement, getting a divorce, having a financial entanglement, harboring resentments, losing a loved one, are just a few of the things that can put someone in a place in which they need to trust God. But if they don't trust in Him and they are full of those fears and worries, it's going to have a negative impact in their health. Arthritis is primarily connected with fatigue and injury and exposure to wet and cold, but stress is another factor. Over 2 million people, at least back in the 60s, were suffering from it. I don't know how many people are today, but I think a lot of them are. And so there are lots of people who put themselves in a situation over things that really don't matter. Dr. McMillan brings about the conflict that arises whenever a survey of land is challenged. Perhaps in the city it's only a matter of inches. Perhaps in the country it might be part of an acre of land, which is a lot to these people, and they're willing to fight for it. And so they have to lawyer up, and they go to the courts, and they make their cases, and there's a prolonged trial. And it gets to the point that a lot of these guys end up losing their health over something that's not that important. Jesus really did say, if a man takes you to court and he wants to take away your coat, let him have your cloak as well. But the disturbed, those who are fighting for their little bit of land, think that Jesus' advice was just idealistic, that it's ill-suited to our modern problems, and that they would rather ignore Jesus and hire an attorney, and they do so to the detriment of their own health. And that brings us back, at least he did for the end of this chapter, of back to the heart. The heart in the sense of the real heart. Fear can precipitate the clotting of the blood, such as occurs for those problems that give us coronary thrombosis. In a 1951 annual meeting of the American Medical Association in Atlantic City, there was a presentation by a Dr. David Mott, and he compared the clotting time of those who are normally happy, at the clotting time of the blood of those who are apprehensive, and those who are highly nervous. Those that are happy had a 8 to 12 minutes clotting time. Those that were just merely apprehensive, 4 to 5 minutes. And those who were highly anxious, 1 to 2 to 3 minutes. That may not mean much to you, but in the previous studies, we talked about you're as old as your arteries. And our arteries become partially obstructed by the tiny cholesterol plaques that get embedded, and the flow of the blood is slow, and it's easy to form clots, which completely stop the circulation. And so because of this, stress not only narrows and damages the arteries themselves, but it also affects the blood. It puts the blood in a place where it's ready to coagulate. It's ready to be thicker and quicker. And that puts people in a higher danger zone for having that thrombosis in their heart. Stress is not the only factor for that. So as he talked about in that other chapter, you got to avoid those animal fats and overeating and smoking. And coming sort of to the end of this, he gives a personal experience in which someone was able to put their trust in God rather than turning to the world's ways and just being overcome with fear and anxiety to the point of ruining their health. And it was his wife. They had gone on a fishing trip, their family up into Canada. They arrived at their cabin in Matwan, Ontario, about 5 p.m. in the evening. They wanted to have fish the next day, and so, like a good guy on vacation, he gets in the boat, takes his daughter with him, and they begin to row up the treacherous, I don't know, treacherous Matatwan Rapids, which was sort of new territory for them. They read about it, got all ready, but they were going to get up there, and they had to go pretty far because the fish weren't biting well, and they went on further. And before sundown, man, the fish just start biting. His wife didn't want to go. She stayed at the cabin. She unpacked. She arranged things. By 8 o'clock, 3 hours later, no sign of them. Then 9, then 9:30, still no daughter, no husband, no boats. She could have become hysterical. She could have opened herself up for a variety of medical conditions that come along with being stressed out. But instead, she calmed herself by quoting Psalm 34. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and he delivered me from all of my fears. And that was her mantra. And that was a reminder that there was a God who would take care of things. So that's what she did. She sat alone in the darkness. She went down on the dock with a lantern so when they did come in, they would know where to stop. Then about 10 o'clock, finally, she hears the voice of her daughter, but not from out on the river, but from behind her. And her daughter comes in saying, Daddy sent me by land because he didn't want to bring me down the rapids in the dark. The fishing really was slow. We had to go up further. Man, they were biting like fire. So it was a great fishing trip in that sense. But now they got to wait for Dad to come home. More waiting. 10:30, no boat. No answer to his wife's calls into the dark, which she began to do, hoping that maybe the sound of her voice would carry. If you've ever been around water, it usually doesn't carry very far. She knew that she was really doing the best that she could by keeping that lantern lit, keeping it on the dock, and praying to God and casting her cares on him. She had ample reason to be overcome by fear, but she confesses that actually she really had a pretty good peace of mind. That peace that passes understanding. She didn't panic. She didn't start off up the stream with a lit lantern trying to find them. She didn't just go off back into town. Back in those days, you had to call for assistance. She kept her faith. She kept her trust. She kept her assurance that God would see them through. It wasn't until 11 o'clock that Dr. McMillan spotted the lantern and pulled the boat safely into the dock. I don't know about you in stressful situations, about the fears that you carry in your life, about the problems that keep you up at night. But we can all be in agreement, and this is a reoccurring theme now in this study, that these things bring diseases into our lives that God says that we can be set free from when we trust him, when we keep his word, when we live in his way. We have to be not like the world, but to live as the children of God, putting our whole hope and trust in him. Hope that this has encouraged you to put your trust in God, and we'll see you next week. Until then, may God be with you.